Every time Ukraine pulls off another improbable victory or achieves a substantial breakthrough, journalists and military analysts return to their familiar refrain that the war will now grind on indefinitely, or that there will be no more advances until spring. From the Battle of Kyiv to Kharkiv and now Kherson, the stark evidence of extraordinary Ukrainian capability and boundless Russian incompetence is quickly forgotten. It seems that underestimating Ukraine's potential and overestimating Russia's strength is a comfort zone the experts cannot tear themselves away from. Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. Please like and subscribe if you like the content we produce and, of course, the excellent speakers, because it will really help to increase the popularity of our content in YouTube's algorithms. Jenny Mathers is a senior academic with expertise in Russian politics and security, gender and conflict. She's been a senior lecturer at Aberystwyth University since 1992. Jenny is experienced in policy analysis, political science, and lecturing. She has a Doctor of Philosophy focused on international relations, gained from Somerville College, Oxford University. Jenny, welcome back to the channel, because this is the second time I've had the privilege to speak to you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, let's start with a question which we hadn't planned on, but obviously events move very rapidly in this war, and it's the missile strike. But rather than tackling this from the angle that the media are currently covering it, the sort of fear and the hype, my worry here is that actually, rather than being afraid of the escalation, that Putin may well actually look at the reaction of the allies, the discordant voices, and this might actually encourage him to embark on further escalation. Now, I'd be interested to hear what you think.
Well, I think Putin is an opportunist, which is something that we've known for a long time. He's maybe not so good at long-term strategy, but good at seizing opportunities. And the nature of the regime that he presides over, which provides relatively few constraints on his decision making and his behavior, allows that to happen. So he doesn't have to go through layers of approval and governance and transparency in order to get something done. And I think so. He's looking for opportunities. He's looking for chances to try and push and to try and use the levers that he has. Now, I think what we've been seeing over the course of this mass invasion stage of the war in Ukraine is that his behavior has really limited the opportunities to arise, if you see what I mean, that by his very actions, he hasn't left a lot of space for serendipity for him to take advantage of. However, I think that the fact that he is convinced that the Western support for Ukraine is going to splinter. He's looking for any evidence, really, that there are divisions. And of course, there are differences of view. And of course, there are, the Western view is not absolutely united, although it's remarkably coherent and consistent, considering that, we're 9 months in now, and, there's still a lot of supply going to Ukraine. There's still a lot of support there, but nevertheless, he's very sensitive, I think, to any suggestion of differences within the Western alliance, and so he's going to try and exploit those, because he just doesn't have that many opportunities for the kind of decision making and action that he excels at. And so I think he's going to try and grab everything he can. And of course, the other aspect of this is the fact that Russia can still do a lot of damage, even though it's struggling to make any significant military gains on the battlefield, and it's being pushed back constantly. As you indicated in your introduction, the Ukrainians are really out-strategizing the Russians to a very large extent. But the Russians still have enough to do damage, and they've got the willingness to do that damage in a very indiscriminate sort of a way, without caring about killing civilians and all the rest of it, and in some ways reveling in it. So yeah, I think he will take any sign of disagreement among Ukraine supporters as an opportunity to push harder and to try and really exploit any differences at all. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, but yeah, I think he definitely will, because he doesn't have that many levers left to push, to be honest. The opportunities for him are constantly narrowing, and even some of his supporters like China and India are, stepping back a little bit, hesitating, giving him signals that perhaps he's going too far. So he's not getting the support that he would have hoped and expected to get, even from those quarters.
And indeed, the media are focusing on the idea that this could have been, an anti-missile missile. This is part of the defensive system. But that sort of misses the point, doesn't it? The fact that Putin is firing what is probably a stock of relatively inaccurate and old missiles and firing them so close to the border, it's as if, that he's taking greater risks there. And it may even be a strategic decision to provoke and push. And some Ukrainian commentators have pointed out that these missiles, even though they didn't hit the electrical infrastructure, they're remarkably close to the grid where Europe and Ukrainian electricity grids join. So this may be part of the energy strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. So, energy has long been something that Putin has sought to exploit and has tried to exploit in lots of different ways, cutting off gas over the years, threatening the supplies and demanding more money from various purchasers, and now, of course, definitely pulling the plug wherever he can. And so, yeah, he sees energy as a weapon. He sees the winter as his ally. And he definitely wants to spread the pain around, and again is convinced that the alliance which supports Ukraine is going to crack once people outside Ukraine begin to suffer, and that there'll be no toleration for that. And so, yeah, anything that can make Poland and Germany and other allies of Ukraine, anything that can make their lives more uncomfortable is going to be a good thing as far as he's concerned. And there's absolutely no sense of sort of ethics or morality sitting behind where to aim the firepower. It seems quite the opposite in many respects.
Let's also tackle the I guess sort of slightly confrontational introduction I made there, but there's definitely a pattern, isn't there, of underestimating Ukrainian capability and also ascribing, their successes to Russian weakness and not necessarily to the training and tactics and equipment and planning, the huge planning that must be going into these Ukrainian offensives. It's almost as if that is sort of skirted over. And, the focus is on, Russian weakness, Russian incompetence, Russian venality. And that's doing a disservice, isn't it? Because the planning that went behind each of these offensives, the months of detail, the efforts to keep them secret and to marshal equipment and supplies, it must be an extraordinary effort, even though we don't have much visibility on that.
Yeah. I think you're right. I mean, I think that as well, the patience, the level of willingness to hold back and carefully target, logistics, and carefully target fuel and ammunition supplies, carefully target command posts, eat away at that capability and degrade it and make the Russian forces much more uncomfortable and much more fragile and vulnerable before going in for the big push. It's brilliant strategy. It's exactly what needs to be done. But in a way, maybe they make it look too easy. I mean, it's and because, as you say, there's this strong sense of operational secrecy, and people have been extraordinarily tight-lipped when it comes to not giving away the details. So it all is happening sort of off stage. And so what we see is sort of long periods of relative inaction when we're not seeing much happening, when the media is starting to say, oh, it's getting boring, it's all bogged down, it's going to last forever. And then suddenly, there'll be a push and we'll see a big dramatic kind of effect. But yes, it's playing to the rhythm that Ukraine needs to play to. and this is the thing, it's not playing to a rhythm which to suit outside audiences. This is not entertainment, this isn't a film, this is careful plotting of using the resources that they've got in the cleverest way they can, and trying to exploit the weaknesses of the enemy, of which there are many. And certainly, there's plenty to be said about Russian military weakness, and the fact that it was hidden, but also the fact that we didn't look carefully enough behind the facade, to understand quite how difficult things were within the military. So there's both things happening. There's these two dynamics which are happening simultaneously, that the Ukrainians are getting cleverer and smarter, and their training is paying off, and their experience is really showing that they can do this in a very effective way, while the Russian capability is going down, it's degrading, and they're losing capacity, and they're losing morale, and the Putin's mobilization is not going to help, hasn't helped at all in the short term, and may not help in the medium to long term either. So these two processes going on are simultaneous, and they're contributing, they're contributing to the overall effect. But yes, we are tending to see a lot more emphasis put on Russia than on Ukraine.
And we have these interesting divisions or little snapshots of military voices as well. And, I've spoken to a few of the good ones, like Ben Hodges, who've been optimistic from the start. And certainly, I think people are very thoughtful and really understand the Russians a bit better, expect that there'll be further surprises actually over the winter. But there's others, like, and to name some names, Mark Milley, and even Lord Dannatt, the head of the British Armed Forces, constantly saying things like, well, Ukraine have done well, but they've reached the limits of their capability now. We need to sue for peace, and it's about to come a frozen conflict. I think personally these views don't take into account much of the evidence we've seen over the last 9 months, but also the evidence of actual NATO tactics and equipment that are actually being deployed by the Ukrainians.
Yeah, and how quickly they've managed to, gain the capacity to use new equipment. And I think from what I've seen and heard, the NATO forces that are helping to train them are really astonished how quickly the Ukrainian soldiers pick up the benefit from the training, are able to use this equipment, and then off they go to use it in the field. So the levels of determination and just the sheer capacity, the sheer will to carry on and push Russia out. I mean, I think often when we're thinking about Russia, we're thinking about maybe the determination that the Soviets showed in the Second World War, to push out the Nazis, but it's hard, it's almost impossible, I think, for today's Russians to demonstrate that same level of determination and capacity, given the fact that they are the invaders, no matter how Putin tries to spin it as an existential threat to Russia. I mean, they are the ones who are fighting on somebody else's territory. So, they just don't have that same determination. They don't have that same, the dynamics are just totally different. And I think that we keep thinking that Russia is going to pull something out of the back pocket. We keep thinking, oh, they've got something hidden away, they've got some master strategy. We would have seen it by now, I think, if they had. I can't think that there would be any reason for holding anything back, given what they've already thrown into the conflict so far. So I really think that the cupboard is looking pretty bare as far as they're concerned, in terms of capabilities, in terms of ideas, just anything that they could bring to this. Whereas the Ukrainians have got the motivation, they've got the morale, they've got the training and the equipment, which is coming in all the time, and they've really mastered some key aspects of contemporary warfare, including the control of the information space, and the fact that they're crafting such compelling narratives which are so appealing at different levels to their international audiences. And this, I think, is such a big difference between what we're seeing in terms of the Ukrainian war effort and what we're seeing in terms of the Russian war effort. Russia's messages and its framing of what's happening are primarily aimed at internal audiences. There's very little of Russia's messaging which is aimed at the international community. There are bits and pieces, but very little actually. And most of what Russia is saying about the war doesn't really resonate with international audiences either. So it might resonate at home, but it kind of falls flat when it tries to travel beyond. Whereas with the Ukrainians, it's exactly the opposite, in that, they pitch things beautifully to appeal to the different supporters. And I think it's amazing how well it's crafted, and they keep coming up with more, compelling narratives and more ways of engaging the international supporters and keeping them on side and carrying this narrative forward. So I think the David and Goliath battle, that we're seeing. I mean, Goliath is definitely falling all over the place, and David is going straight for the target. So.
And humor is a key part of it, isn't it? I mean, one of the things that endears Ukrainians, and I think it works because it's also natural, it's organic. You have NAFO, which for anyone who's not aware of that, who's watching the channel, it's all over YouTube, Twitter rather, and it's people having avatars of little dogs in military uniforms and various other guises posting memes all over, and some of them are hilarious, some of them are quite brutal and vicious, but it demonstrates an extraordinary, I say, morale.
Yeah. Of course, NAFO is largely the external supporters of Ukrainians. That's I think the big kind of drive from it. But also the Ukrainians' own messaging and comms is definitely has a sort of a light humorous touch to a large extent, and this is something that Russian official communications really struggles with. I mean, Russian official communication is turgid, it's tedious, it's kind of boring actually, and they don't have that facility with humor. When humor comes in, it's quite nasty. It's not something that you really want to laugh along with. Whereas with the Ukrainians, it's funny, it's clever, and often, of course, touches the heartstrings. And I think the way that they're using animals, and the Ukrainians' care for animals is just brilliant. It really it's a shorthand way of saying, we are civilized people, we are humane people who care about all living creatures. We even look after bats who are roosting in the places where we're living, and squirrels and so on, and we save baby deer that we find injured through the war. And we rescue cats and dogs, and so on. So it's a very, it makes them, it humanizes them, it reaches across these kinds of international barriers and language barriers and cultural barriers, and says, we have the same kind of values, we're the same kind of people. And I think it's super effective. And I'm not aware of any other kind of wartime messaging campaign that plays on this particular set of feelings in quite the same way.
And there's a lot of commonality, I think, isn't there, especially between the British and the Blitz, and the sort of humor that you would have got then at the time, and also a stoicism, a lack of hysteria in the face of terrifying circumstances. I think you can see that in the way Ukrainians deport themselves. I mean, I've now interviewed several dozen, and they've all been incredibly analytical. They've said very emotional things, but they've been able to analyze it and speak in a very compelling way. Occasionally Russians come across as pretty hysterical. I mean, not just the I don't mean hysterical funny either. I mean literally, on the verge of a kind of madness. And there's a stark difference, I think.
There is, and all of those sort of videos that we're seeing about people, sheltering in metro stations or sheltering in basements, singing, keeping their spirits up, all of that sort of thing, is very inspiring, rather than giving way to panic and distress. And there might be some of that as well behind the scenes, but nevertheless, really this determination to keep each other's spirits up, and to be positive and to sort of look forward, is really extraordinary. And I think it really is such a sharp contrast between that determination and the voices of people outside Ukraine who are saying, oh, well, the Ukrainians need to compromise and they need to sue for peace, and we need to have, an immediate end to the war, and so on and so on. It's a very stark contrast.
Well, let's go back to the idea of tipping points. We had the Battle of Kyiv, Kharkiv Oblast was obviously taken, and now we've had this lightning advance on Kherson. And again, it's not just the Russians withdrew; they were forced out through necessity. But what comes next? Mariupol, Crimea. Could we actually see this side of the new year, where many of the pundits predicted, these can't happen for many, many months? I don't know what your thoughts are.
Gosh, I mean, I know that the Ukrainians keep surprising external pundits, and I mean, definitely they're heading for Crimea. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that that is the goal, among other goals that they are definitely determined. And it's very impressive because for such a long time, I think, from 2014, for years and years, the conventional wisdom, certainly outside Ukraine, was, well, Crimea, it's a lost cause. The Russians have taken it. They're not going to let it go. Yes, it's wrong, but what can we do? Nobody can do anything. They're entrenched. And, now it's like, well, actually, maybe they're not so entrenched. So I have no good at predicting timescales. I have no kind of knowledge about how quickly they might be able to move, but we keep underestimating how quickly the Ukrainians can move. They clearly have got very good local intelligence. They clearly have got a very good idea of pressure points and weak points in and around Crimea. And they clearly have a plan. And that plan involves taking it back. And so I suspect they will bide their time, choose their targets carefully. And, it's not going to be easy. But I think that determination and that willingness to be patient and go step by step, follow the plan, I think that's going to stand them in very good stead. And that's where I think that's one of the things that the Russian military has proved themselves not to be very good at, or the military that's got left after the more elite and experienced elements of it have largely been destroyed. So yes, I think that in the face of that steely determination by the Ukrainians, I think that's part of what the Russians are fearing, is that they don't have anything like that. And so yes, when they're faced with that, then the disintegration begins.
And I think a lot of the pundits, and especially even military people, are saying, well, it's either Crimea or Donbass. You can't go after both simultaneously. And that is probably true. That probably would be a stretch. Or go down through Mariupol first and then, cut Crimea off. I have a sense, though, that there are surprises coming. I know the barriers physically and geographically are enormous of retaking Crimea. But I have a sense that strategically, if he were to decapitate and go after Crimea first, that would be the death knell of Putin. That would be utter failure. And he wouldn't need to take the entire Donbass, because then the regime potentially would turn in on itself at that point. So I wonder if we're seeing another feint, like the previous Kharkiv offensive, another feint where they perhaps make it look like they're going after Mariupol, and actually then pull something that no one was expecting. I mean, who knows?
Yeah, exactly. Who knows? Well, even if the loss of Crimea doesn't end up with the loss of Putin, nevertheless, it would still be such a blow to the Kremlin's aims in Ukraine, and being the first prize that they took back in 2014, and took it with so little resistance for all kinds of reasons at the time. I think the loss of that would really take the heart out of the other soldiers. It would be much harder for them to fight on, knowing that particular piece of territory had been lost. So it would be very important symbolically as well as strategically. So it wouldn't surprise me if they did decide to go for it sooner rather than later. But but again, they will make their plans. They know what their strengths are and where the pressure points are for Russia, and they'll do what they need to do. But yeah, I'm sure we'll see a battle for Crimea.
And I've seen in some of the interviews you've done recently, you've said that one of the pivotal things here is going to be how the Russian military hold themselves together, and
Yeah.
all the evidence is that not very well, I think, is the phrase you used. But they do have an ideological core which is made up of mercenaries, which is the Wagnerites. Um, do you think that force will be able to hold it together when the mainstream army is disintegrating, or do you think there are weaknesses within the model that Wagner operates?
Mm. Well, in a brutal armed force, Wagner group is like, brutality on steroids from what we've seen recently. It's just take everything to an extreme and then double it. So they have the ruthlessness, but I'm not sure that they have, I mean, the numbers, even if they emptied all the prisons, I'm not sure they would really be able to muster the kinds of strengths that they would need. Um, and they're also fighting alongside and in the midst of an army which is not got any sort of strong commitment to the fight, or and I'm not convinced that all of the soldiers who fight with Wagner have got much of a strong commitment either. I mean, they're the ones who are not ex-prisoners would have joined for monetary reasons, and reasons of adventure and machoism and all the rest of it. And then the ones who've they've got from prison, or more recently, well, desperation, lack of a better alternative, die in prison, have a chance of living. Well, there's not much of a choice, is it? So I'm not sure how well all of that's going to hang together. And I think that the fact that they're having to use such brutal tactics against the traitors, the ones who've given up or the ones who've tried to escape, I think it shows they don't really feel they've got a strong grip. Because if you have a strong, cohesive ideology, morale, commitment, loyalty from your troops, you don't need to treat them in this way. That's not necessary. And clearly it is necessary for them to frighten the others and to try and deter them from seeking escape. So I'm not convinced that Wagner is as strong as some people think it is. I mean, it's clearly ruthless. But how clever are they? How strategic are they? How strong are they? How loyal are they? And loyal to what? So I think once you go down the path of using mercenaries, then you're open up a whole big can of worms, which I think, the regime in Russia has got so many problems in fighting this war. And it seems like they're, in trying to use Wagner to help solve them, they're just creating even more. So I don't think that this is going to be the solution to their problems by any stretch.
And it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because Prigozhin, whether Putin remains or falls, whether the war is successful or not, and it's looking like it's not going to be, Prigozhin must be saving some of the core strength of his Wagnerites with the view to potentially the succession within Russia. And maybe for him, that is even more important. Preserving that strength, preserving some kind of reputation for what is potentially going to be the internal battle that follows this war.
Yes, I mean, I'm not an expert on Wagner or on Prigozhin by any stretch, but I mean, from what I've seen, um, he's in it for himself. He's clearly looking for money and for power, and this has been the sort of the logic behind the whole of this phenomenon, and how it's been deployed and where they go and what they do and all the rest of it. So yes, I would think absolutely he's got an eye to what happens after the war in Ukraine, however the war in Ukraine ends up. Then he wants a future beyond that, and that future is presumably not continuously sending out mercenaries around the world. It's going to be something more comfortable, and something with a bit more oomph to it. Now, whether he is a credible successor to Putin, or whether he might be the kind of the gray cardinal behind the successor and kind of keep his position as a subordinate, but somebody who is obviously very important and is able to leverage that for material gain for himself. Yeah, I don't know. It's a murky world of trying to estimate what might be going on in the inner circles of the Kremlin. So
I'm not sure there are any experts anymore, are there? I mean, even those who perhaps might have had communication with the inner circle, like Venediktov and others, I think those avenues are closed now, aren't they? And it's a very closely guarded world, the inner circle.
It's even more opaque than it has been in the past, perhaps. But yeah, I just imagine that they're really worried in the Kremlin. I can just, if they have the extent to which they really understand what's happening, they must be really worried, because almost nothing that they're doing is working, and all the backpedaling that's happening, even in the Russian media, the realizations are coming, and they don't have any answers, they don't have any solutions. It's just more of the same. No forward vision, only looking in the rearview mirror. So yeah, it's a pretty grim prospect to be yoked to a regime of that kind, which is heading for a dead end.
And what really, I think, upsets some of the propagandists, but definitely the nationalists, as is evidenced on Telegram channels and so on, are the so-called red lines. Rather than being, a no holds barred sort of tyrant, Putin, in some eyes in Russia, is seen to be soft, isn't he? He's constantly laid out red lines. Finland and Sweden joining NATO was a red line. The Kherson bridge was a red line. The Kerch bridge, rather, sorry. And then Kherson. There have been numerous red lines, which, as soon as they are broken or exceeded, are quickly replaced by another red line, another terror threat. So it does seem that he just uses these threatening stances as a strategic form of behavior to try and limit Western unity, limit the supply of arms, but doesn't actually follow through. And I think that is angering some of the more extreme elements in Russia, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think it's so interesting, because for years now, Putin has relied upon his reputation for being tough and ruthless and unpredictable, to do a lot of the work of foreign policy for Moscow. And so, he's been able, with relatively small effort, to get a huge response, especially from the West. Putin does something small and everyone else goes, oh no, we have to step back. This is dangerous. This is terrible. What's he going to do next? And so, we give him the space and are, constantly, sort of amazed by every little thing. And because in the past he's picked and chosen where he puts his effort when it's a serious military effort. For example, Syria, where it was really clear that he wasn't going to get serious pushback from the West when it came to military intervention in Syria, and he didn't. Or annexing Crimea, it was clear that he wasn't going to face the kind of opposition that he's facing now in Ukraine. And I think maybe he just got complacent and doesn't really know what to do when he meets serious resistance, because he's been accustomed to picking and choosing his battles, only using relatively a little bit of effort, of force, to get what he wants, and relying upon his reputation, what Mark Galeotti calls dark power, this reputation for being scary, and letting that do the work. Now the scales have fallen from people's eyes. Now Russia's reputation as a strong, fearsome military power is lying in tatters. In spite of what people are saying about, oh, Russia's going to pull something out of the hat. Actually, we've seen that at the Shanghai Cooperation meeting, where one after the other Central Asian leaders made Putin wait, embarrassed him, humiliated him. And they would never have done that a year ago. It's like they know the power has shifted. They're not afraid anymore. And this is the problem. He doesn't know what to do, because without that fear, he's relied upon it for so long. Without it now, he doesn't know what to do. I think it really is lost and floundering. And so yes, he'll say, oh, you mustn't cross this red line. This is definitely bad things will happen. And then the line is crossed. It's like, oh, okay. Maybe I'll just ignore that and try and distract attention and find something else to talk about instead. But I suspect he doesn't know himself where the ultimate red line might possibly be, because the ground keeps shifting and he keeps shifting with it. And pretty soon he's going to end up in a place that he didn't expect to be. Well, he may already be in a place he didn't expect to be in terms of what is happening that he just can't control. And this is the thing, that's too many things that are out of control for him, and he can't. Those levers that used to work, it's like they're not connected anymore. You know, he can press the buttons, but nothing is happening at the other end. So, yeah, I think he's probably pretty confused.
And it's the politics of the mafiosi, isn't it? I mean, as long as you're powerful, as long as you have leverage, people will pay homage. But as your economic and political power ebbs away, it's become apparent that Putin has no friends diplomatically. He only has, contingent alliances or people who would have supported him out of, I say self-interest, his interests to their country, but no genuine allies as such, except perhaps Assad and North Korea. And as they say, with friends like these, who needs enemies?
Yeah, it's a problem that Moscow has had for many generations, back in Soviet times as well, is finding allies, finding true allies, and arguably Moscow's never really had them properly. It's always been an unequal power relationship. Either there've been, patron clients with Moscow is the strong power, or now, as we see, it's flipped. China is the strong power, Russia is the supplicant. But there doesn't seem to be much in the way of, we have shared values, we are our allies, we want to work together, we have longer term visions together. It's quite short term, utilitarian, transactional, and I think that works up to a point. And there are some benefits to it because it doesn't get you locked into, big ideological battles. But I think we're seeing the limits of it now, and there just aren't very many international partners that Russia can rely upon, and rely upon for what. So yeah, I think he's increasingly backing himself into a corner, and isolating his country and his society from large parts of the world, maybe for an extended period of time, depending on how things play out with the war and afterwards.
And we're starting to see some early signs of protest at last, aren't we? Not protest on moral grounds, but we're seeing mothers' protests who are trying to retrieve their husbands and sons from the appalling conditions in the army they've been placed. There are echoes of Afghanistan, and eventually those protests actually did reach quite a critical level and made a difference. Do you see internal protest in Russia on the rise, and will it make any kind of dent in the regime's thinking?
It's so hard to know, because I think the Kremlin has done a good job of laying the foundations of its narrative, demonizing Ukraine and demonizing, successive governments in Kyiv. And so, from 2013 onwards, it's been hammering away at the it's legitimate, it's neo-Nazi, it's far right, it's dangerous, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that has had an impact on the way that a lot of Russians approach the whole question, which I think wasn't the case when you think about the war in Afghanistan. I mean, there was no real, the Soviet people didn't have any particular bone to pick with the Afghans. It was, it was to a certain extent that case in Chechnya, and that the Chechens were bandits and all the rest of it. But I don't think it was quite as nasty and determined and over such a long period as we've had with Ukraine. And so I think that makes a difference, in the sense that there maybe is that doubt in people's minds about, well, what's going on there with Ukraine, and that maybe might shape a willingness to support the regime and a willingness to provide some kind of support for the war, even if it's passive. I think the fact that so many Russians have left the country out of either principled protest against the war or fear of being mobilized and taken into the army. So they've lost a big part of the society that would have maybe formed the backbone of more serious protests and more prolonged protests. So in some way, and many of the opposition leaders are either in exile or they're in prison. And so in some ways, I feel like we're looking at a civil society which is kind of leaderless. It's kind of lost in a way.
Anemic, kind of.
Yes, it's like, well, which way is it going to go? And it seems so very much left up to the individual to battle with their own conscience and to try and work out where they dare to go in their own minds and as well as their own actions. How are they going to reconcile their position with their own consciences and with what their children might ask them in the future and so on. So all this is going on, which I think is such a different context from the war in Afghanistan, when the Committee of Soldiers' Mothers began and when it started to be a grassroots movement and really began to develop some strength, and the war in Chechnya, the first war in particular, where the mothers were going to Chechnya trying to retrieve their sons. And there was a real kind of dynamism behind it as a sort of a movement. And what's happening now feels very disconnected. It feels like little pockets here and there of little groups of family members, particularly mothers and wives and so on. But their demands, from what I've seen, seem quite limited as well. It's much more about legality, appealing to legality, or appealing to, well, you need to send them back because they haven't had any rest. Or it's not so much of this war is evil and it must stop. It's very much around, well, you need to treat our people better, which is a different, I think it's a very different position. And so, yeah, it's a complicated one. I unless things really develop and build up a head of steam, which they might do, I don't see it as really tipping the balance over.
And we also know, sorry.
I was going to say it's an irritant for the Kremlin and the Ministry of Defense. It's a nagging, thing that's going on, and they don't particularly like it. But I don't think it's a threat in quite the same way.
And if it became a threat, they kind of know how to deal with it, don't they? Because they suppressed a near revolution in Belarus by completely driving away, almost the entire Belarusian media and all of the activists, and replacing them with Russian propagandists. The FSB came in, changed the tactics, and crushed the revolution there. So they've got the machinery, and they've got the amorality and the willingness to use force. So, if a much more sort of, activist-led and self-organizing protest in Belarus, with, the strength of the national identity they have there, not as strong as Ukrainian, but they definitely have that. If that didn't succeed, the Russian civil society and sense of identity is so much weaker, isn't it? And their capability of self-organization is so much more primitive.
Yeah, I think over the years they've been beaten down, really, in Russia, and all the measures that have been taken, particularly since 2012 when Putin came back into the presidency, as sort of step by step over a period of time, this crackdown and that pressure there, and this new law and that thing there, and individually each one perhaps isn't a death knell to civil society, but the cumulative effect, by the time you get to 2022, you look around and say, okay, where are the tools to try and use for organization and publicity and motivation and morale? And they've been scattered, they've been crushed. They're not available anymore. And people, I think, in Russia have internalized, for lots of good reasons, the idea that you have to keep your head down, and that it's just too dangerous and risky. And because the use of force and the use of the law is so arbitrary, you can't count on it being safe. It's too dangerous to even try. And I think that as long as the security services in Russia are loyal to whoever is in the Kremlin, and as long as they're willing to use that sort of level of ruthlessness, and the courts are going to back them up, as long as there's that system there of repression, it's going to be really hard for civil society to, especially sort of orphaned, if you like, without the sort of leadership, without the sort of people who really had the drive to push it forward. I think without those things, it's really going to struggle, and it's going to take something quite dramatic. I mean, maybe a military defeat in Ukraine might do it. That might encourage the security forces to say, this leadership is incompetent, let's get rid of it. That's a possibility, but it's really hard to see a change, serious political change coming from Russian civil society. As much as I wish it were possible to see that, and as much as I would love to say, that the women of Russia and soldiers' mothers are going to come and sort things out, I just that's not where it seems to be heading.
It's perhaps a little fanciful or optimistic, and they're not just confining their efforts to repression, are they? There's actually now a huge effort to indoctrinate the younger generation, to create an educational syllabus and environment where children will inform on their parents, as we saw in, well, the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, and to indoctrinate them with a very distorted nationalistic view of history. And that potentially is working, as terrifying as that might seem.
Absolutely. And this, I think, is one of the most sinister aspects of this whole sort of war effort at home on the side of the Russians. And this is something that Alison Edwards and I are working on now. And I think you've interviewed her as well as part of this podcast series. And I think it's chilling the way that it's such a long-term strategy. This is a long game being played. You're talking about targeting 5-year-olds. And so they're betting that they or people like them will still be in power when 5-year-olds are 18 and 20 and 25 and 30. Because I think they know that they've lost the youth of Russia in terms of the older teenagers, people in their 20s, maybe into their early 30s. That's a generation which has got very little time for this regime, and are quite skeptical. But the ones below that, they're still impressionable. And it's like they've decided, right, okay, we're going to get that generation, and we're going to make sure that our future, or the future of this regime, is secure. And yes, I think there may be two aspects of it that I think are particularly interesting in a dark way. One of them is the way that there's so many efforts being made to make personal connections between the war in Ukraine and the soldiers who are fighting there and school children. Getting school children and schools to sort of adopt soldiers from local areas and send them care packages and write to them and knit them, socks with the Z on them and so on, and getting them to have sort of walls of remembrance for the ones who've died, and really creating this, sort of hero narrative around them. It makes that personal connection between the children and the war, and it brings the war into their everyday lives in a way which otherwise it wouldn't, because it would be on the news, which they wouldn't pay attention to at that age, and it might be something that their parents would talk about, but it wouldn't be something that would interest them. But if it's into the everyday activities of the school, which is the child's life, really, then it's going to be there in their minds, and they're going to have that personal identity with the soldiers, and see their cause as the cause that the children should support. So I think that's one thing, which is it's very clever, but I think it's super worrying, because it's going to be much more difficult then, once that has taken root, for a different way of thinking about the war to replace it. And then the other thing, of course, is, as you mentioned, this distorted view of history and what history is, and this view of young people as the guardians of history, of a particular version of history, and the fact that the responsibility is being placed upon them to challenge anyone who transgresses against this version of history. And this is where we've seen children reporting their teachers, for example, for not being sufficiently with the message from the Kremlin, and so on. So yeah, it is worrying, because it's this creating a mindset of people who are children who are going to possibly grow up with a very unquestioning acceptance of certain truths in their lives. And, that's really worrying for the future. If you think about, are we looking forward to a future possibly of a Russia which has got, a more democratic way of organizing itself, a more transparent way of organizing itself, a more humane way of treating its citizens, a different attitude towards authority and what that means? Well, not if the Kremlin succeeds in the indoctrination of Russia's youth.
And it's a
Then we're
version
going
of
to have
history, isn't it, which discourages thoughtfulness. It discourages doubt. It's history with purpose. And yet, when we speak to Ukrainians, they have a much more complex version of history. It's nuanced, it's conflicting, it's messy. It doesn't give you a clear narrative and direction and purpose. And I think that's why Timothy Schneider's lectures have been so interesting, because they've got all the mess and complexity, and they're analyzing the future interpretations that then get placed on the past and dissect all of that. All of this complexity is stripped away from the Russian version of history. It's designed to imbue an imperial, purpose-led view of the world, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one that doesn't lend itself to questioning. And I think most governments would quite like to be able to present a version of history which is flattering and so on, and you certainly get that sense from some people in power, or certain political positions, in the US where I'm from, and in the UK where I live now. You get a sense that there's a right sort of history that certain people want to promote, but this really takes it to extremes, and it is so distorted and so rigid, I guess is the word I'm looking for. It just doesn't allow for any interpretation or challenge. And it is in many ways very Soviet in that sense, that it's got, there's one right way of understanding things, and that's it. I mean, I remember when I was living in Moscow in 1995, and there was this exhibition in I can't remember which museum it was now, but it was the actual map that had divided the Stalin Hitler sort of pact, that drew a line and was dividing territory between who would take what. And I remember seeing there was a Russian family looking at the map at the same time that I was, and the man said to his wife, "I can't believe it. I can't believe it." Obviously, he'd been taught a very different version of history, and seeing, being confronted with the actual evidence of his eyes, he still found it difficult. And, just imagining at some point in the future, these children as grown-up people being confronted with evidence that everything they were told in their childhood about history was a lie. There's going to be a lot of psychic trauma going on in the future, potentially, of this society. So yeah, I mean, there's so many crimes being committed, by the regime. Obviously, the most serious ones are happening in Ukraine, but there's crimes against Russian society happening too, as well.
And that was the generation of the 90s. The generation of the 90s were faced with the full impact of the lies of the past, when the full history came out, and then suddenly the rush of Western literature, history, film, everything that they had been denied came out in a huge torrent, like a cultural injection, which isn't to say that everyone in Russia took advantage of that. No, not everyone's going to go out and watch, Italian art house cinema or whatever it happens to be. But there was a huge awareness of the falsification of the past. And I find it remarkable that generation that were exposed to the full force of history and the realization that they'd been lied to, many of those people now are totally imbued with the current propaganda and are unquestioning of it, even though the methodology is the same, the tone is the same, and in many respects, the people who run the country are the inheritors of if not directly, that Soviet system, then certainly the machinery of control and coercion. They are the direct descendants of it.
Yeah. I guess it's so much more comfortable to believe in, or to pretend to believe in, a story where your side is always right. And, complexity is messy and it's difficult, and we have to confront our own complicity in things that our societies got wrong, and things our governments got wrong, and mistakes that they made. And, you know, I can kind of understand at a human level the desire to just say, no, I'm not going to think about that anymore. This is a much better story. I'd much rather have this story in front of me, and it allows me to be, self-righteous, and it allows me to think good things and positive things about myself and my past, and I don't have to worry about any of this horrible, upsetting stuff. And I think this is another perhaps dynamic that's going on in Russian society now, in terms of people who just want to look away from the war. They don't want to have to take a position. They don't want to have to acknowledge that, there's a moral imperative staring them in the face. It's just so very uncomfortable.
There's a quite a well-known book from the industry I work in called Don't Make Me Think, and it's about designing websites. But that could equally be applied to the strategy here, isn't it? Don't make me think about the past. Don't make me feel guilt. At the very least, I want to believe that you lot are as bad as us, that it's all the same, and I don't have to feel morally inferior.
Yeah.
And as you say, it's a kind of comfort zone that people can retreat into.
Yeah, absolutely. And this idea of everybody's as bad as everybody else, I mean, we see that being articulated very, very openly now by Russian officials and people who are apologizing for what's happening in Ukraine. And yeah, it's taking them to a very dark place, this search for some sort of comfort, and search for a mission and a purpose for Russia. And it's such a shame, because yeah, it's you look at where everything's heading, and it's hard to feel optimistic at all, because it's very difficult to find any sense of hope here. They seem to be really determined to end badly, and take as many people down with them as possible.
And my last question, because I know it's late, and it's extraordinary to do this at this time of night, but I know our time is limited. But the question really comes from a sort of observation, which I think passes a lot of the media by. But in Russian history, there are periods of openness, which are often tracked, and that openness is often viewed from the point of view of glasnost and big political movements. But actually, in conjunction with these periods of openness, or openness to ideas, you also can track a huge influx of foreign workers and foreigners into Russia. So it happened at the time of Peter the Great. Many of the great buildings and architecture were designed by Italians. The engineering behind the building and the works that were produced, the bricks and so on, would have been potentially Dutch and German architects, engineers, German scientists in the 19th century. So even the walls of the Kremlin, which you think is quintessentially Russian, I believe are designed and based on Italian ideas and Italian architects who came over. And then in the 1890s, you would have had the British and the Dutch coming in as engineers to build factories and the railways and so on. And in the 90s, again, a huge influx of foreigners. And it seems that these spurts of growth and development in Russia's history coincide with an openness to collaborating with foreign techniques and foreigners. Even the Soviet Union, which is seen as a quintessentially Russian leap forward, many of the machine tools and the designs of the factories and even some of the raw materials came from America.
Yes,
and
some of which were stolen.
Yes,
or ideas through sort of industrial intelligence. Yes, yeah. My students are always shocked when I sort of talk about how far back in time that practice goes of surreptitiously taking a bit of
That's right.
intelligence.
But
And
American,
using
I mean, I was shocked to read an article of how many actual American engineers came over. So yes, a lot of ideas were stolen, but there was a huge influx, and entire factories were dismantled and shipped, maybe slightly, older generation technologies. But there was, despite Russia being perceived as the enemy, certainly in the 30s, there was a huge amount of physical collaboration going on. And then, of course, you had the 90s. And I think this period is going to be extraordinarily distinct from the point of view that not only have hundreds of thousands of middle-class Russians fled, you've had a vast exodus of Western know-how, capital, and people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's an aspect of Soviet and Russian history I hadn't really thought so much about. Although, of course, one of my colleagues in the department I'm at now is descended or is related to John Hughes, the Welsh mining engineer who went to Donetsk and started a community there and so on. So yeah, this interplay, I think. It just goes to show you how important it is for societies in general, I think, to be open, and that the idea of closing everything down and only communing with yourselves is a really self-defeating project. And I say this as well, thinking about all the debates about immigration and in countries around Europe, including the UK and in the US and so on, and this sort of fear of foreigners and which is bizarre when you think about all the sort of wealth of talent and experience and skills that can come with that kind of mixing and of different ideas. And I think this is another worry, is that by closing itself off to the outside world, as Putin is doing for Russia one way and another, he's really kind of sentencing Russia or condemning Russia to a period of real stagnation, and going backwards in terms of all kinds of intellectual and economic and other kinds of artistic perhaps developments. That it's going to be a very stunted period of growth that Russia is going to be going through as long as this sort of isolation lasts, I think.
Possibly even deeper and more affecting than the Brezhnev period, because even though that was described as a period of stagnation, I get the impression that not middle class, but the professional classes and education, did nurture a generation, a sophisticated, well-educated generation, even under Brezhnev. In some ways, what's happening now is scarier and more damaging.
Yeah. No, I would agree with that. There were some openings even in the Brezhnev's time, and it seems like there aren't very many chinks of light left in the brick wall that Putin is busy building around Russia. So.
Well, Jenny, it's going to be intriguing to see how this plays out. I'm sure before the war is ended, we will get the chance to speak again, and I'm sure there'll be many more dramatic events to dissect. But I'm incredibly grateful that you've spent so long, and it being so late in the evening as well. Fantastically insightful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.